Roxanne, 32 years old, waited for my public humiliation to begin. My sister scanned the crowded ballroom with her perfect media-ready smile, before raising the microphone to her lips as if she were about to announce a grand prize. She gestured toward me in my oversized black clothes and laughed softly before delivering the line that was designed to destroy me. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a special last-minute item for anyone who needs their driveway shoveled during this blizzard. Who wants to start the bidding at just $1 for my failure of a little sister? A wave of cruel laughter rippled through the front tables, where the city's elite sat sipping their expensive champagne while watching my misery. I kept my head down to hide the tears burning my eyes while my fingers dug into the wooden frame of the canvas I was holding against my chest. It was the only thing I had left in this world, a slashed and ruined painting that represented the last shred of my dignity. The laughter was becoming unbearable until a deep voice cut through the noise from the back of the room like a thunderclap. $1 million. The entire ballroom went instantly silent as every head turned to find the source of that impossible offer. A man in a dark suit stood up slowly while my sister's confident smile vanished from her face in a matter of seconds. She looked from the stranger to me with confusion because she had no idea who I really was. Before we reveal why a stranger paid a fortune for a woman worth nothing to her family, please. 2 years ago, the first blizzard of the season drove me to my sister's doorstep in Omaha, with nothing but a hollow chest and a single battered suitcase containing the remains of my broken life. My divorce had been finalized only 48 hours prior, leaving me with zero assets while a sudden corporate downsizing stripped away the design job that had been my only source of stability. I stood trembling on the porch of the sprawling limestone villa belonging to my sister Miranda, listening to the muffled sound of wind chimes while waiting for the heavy oak door to swing open. When Miranda finally appeared, she didn't offer a hug or a warm word of welcome, but instead leaned against the doorframe while scanning my disheveled appearance with a look of clinical disappointment. She adjusted her silk robe and pointed toward the foyer without stepping aside, making it clear that my presence was an inconvenience she was only gracing with her reluctant charity. "You can stay, Roxanne, but this isn't a hotel where you can just sit around and mope about your failed marriage while I foot the bill for your recovery," Miranda stated as she led me through the pristine hallway toward a narrow door near the kitchen. She explained the terms of what she called our family contract, which stipulated that I would receive shelter in the unfinished basement storage room in exchange for performing every household chore without any financial compensation. The basement was a cavernous, frigid space filled with stacks of cardboard boxes and old furniture where the smell of damp concrete clung to the stagnant air. There was no proper bed, only a thin mattress tossed on the floor in a corner where the insulation was still exposed, and the light was provided by a single flickering bulb. I accepted her terms in silence because the alternative was a homeless shelter in the middle of a Nebraska winter. Yet I could see the satisfaction in her eyes as she realized she had just gained a full-time servant who couldn't afford to quit. During our first dinner together, my brother-in-law Preston sliced into a thick steak and looked at me with a smirk that made my stomach churn with immediate resentment. He wiped a drop of red wine from his lip and leaned back in his chair while his expensive watch caught the overhead light, highlighting the massive wealth gap that now defined our relationship. "This house doesn't support parasites, so you should at least learn how to scrub the toilets properly if you expect to keep a roof over your head," Preston remarked before laughing at his own crude joke. Miranda didn't defend me, but instead nodded in agreement while discussing her upcoming social events, treating me as if I were a piece of furniture that had suddenly learned how to listen. I realized then that my sister and Preston didn't want to help me find my feet again because they preferred having someone they could look down upon to make their own success feel even more significant. My life quickly devolved into a grueling cycle of physical labor that began long before the sun rose and ended only when my muscles screamed with exhaustion late at night. I spent my days scrubbing floors on my hands and knees, doing endless loads of laundry, and preparing meals that I was often too tired to even taste while Miranda monitored my progress with a checklist. Every ounce of my privacy was stripped away as Preston would frequently barge into the basement to demand a fresh towel or to complain about a missed spot on his car, never once knocking or acknowledging my humanity. The constant belittlement started to wear down my spirit until I felt like a ghost, haunting the lower levels of their perfect hollow lives, while my old identity as an artist seemed like a dream from a different lifetime. One night, while I was pushing aside some heavy crates to clear a path to the water heater, I stumbled upon several crusty containers of leftover paint that some contractors had abandoned in a dark, damp corner. The brushes were stiff, and the colors were limited to industrial grays and muddy earth tones, but the sight of those pigments ignited a desperate spark in my chest that I thought had been extinguished forever. I dragged a few discarded plywood boards from a pile of construction debris and set them against the cinderblock wall, feeling my heart race for the first time in months as I dipped a makeshift palette knife into the thick, pungent liquid. I began to paint with a frantic energy that bordered on madness, pouring all my suppressed rage and agonizing sorrow onto the rough wooden surfaces until the basement was no longer just a prison. The strokes were jagged and raw, forming abstract landscapes of the Omaha winter that felt more real than the polished rooms upstairs where Miranda and Preston played their games of status and ego. I spent my few hours of sleep hunched over those boards, using the dim light of the flickering bulb to capture the exact shade of a bruised sky or the cold loneliness of a snow-covered field. In the absolute silence of the underground shadows, I reached for a small brush and carefully inscribed 2 letters in the bottom corner of my first completed piece. The signature RX appeared for the first time on the splintered wood, marking the birth of a secret self that Miranda could never reach and a talent that her cruelty could never truly contain. That spring, the snow began to melt outside the windows, but the chilling atmosphere inside that house remained unchanged, even as the first weak rays of sun struggled to pierce through the bare trees. Miranda happened to walk down to the basement on a Tuesday afternoon to check if I had finished cleaning the old storage shelves when she suddenly stopped in front of a painting titled "Melting Snow" that I had leaned against the cinderblock wall. She stood there with her eyes narrowed in a calculating gaze while her manicured fingers brushed over the rough surface of the plywood board I had painstakingly adorned with haunting shades of white and gray. Instead of offering a single word of praise or a look of recognition for my tireless creative efforts in the shadows, Miranda simply smirked with disdain and let out a biting remark that made my chest tighten with immediate pain. "This gaudy and gloomy thing actually has a small use since it could temporarily hide the moldy patch on the back wall of my office, instead of just sitting here gathering dust in this damp corner," Miranda stated in a patronizing tone, as if she were granting me the greatest favor in the entire world. She reached down and grabbed the painting without asking for my permission or waiting for my consent, asserting that she was merely helping me clear out some trash so the basement would look less cluttered and more organized. I could only stand there in silence and watch my sister's back as she walked away with the piece that contained all my soul and hope, because I had no right to demand anything while living on her reluctant charity. Miranda stepped out of the basement with her prize in hand while remaining completely ignorant of the fact that she had just stolen the very essence of my artistic spirit. The reality was that Miranda had taken that painting directly to a prominent interior designer in the city, who was desperate for unique pieces with depth to complete a project for an extremely wealthy client. The designer was immediately captivated by my raw and moody strokes, and did not hesitate to pay Miranda $5,000 in cash to secure the artwork on the spot. Miranda tucked that large sum of money into her purse with a satisfied smile, because she realized that keeping a failure like me was finally starting to bring in a lucrative profit without her having to exert any real effort. She kept the true value of the painting a complete secret, and even felt a surge of pride in her ability to deceive me by turning my discarded wooden scraps into a thick stack of $100 bills. Later that evening, Miranda sat at the polished kitchen table and tossed a crumpled $50 bill in front of me with a look of contempt, as if she were handing a pittance to a beggar on the street. "I had to work very hard to sell your pile of junk to a thrift shop for a few measly bucks, so take this and go buy yourself some sweets or something to make your miserable life a bit easier." Miranda lied through her teeth, while Preston sat beside her and laughed under his breath as he continued eating his dinner. I slowly picked up the small bill and felt a wave of humiliation wash over me because I knew my hard work was being dismissed, even though I could not possibly imagine that my work had been stolen for such a staggering amount. I retreated to the basement with that $50 in my hand, while having no idea that my anonymous identity was already starting to cause a stir among art collectors, thanks to that stolen masterpiece. The painting, Melting Snow, with the modest signature RX in the bottom corner, began a remarkable journey through the art market as it was repeatedly sold at higher prices through various private auctions. Art critics began writing articles praising the mysterious genius hiding somewhere in Omaha who possessed such profound spiritual experiences and a brushwork that was impossible to mistake for anyone else. Meanwhile, Miranda remained completely oblivious to the fame that the pseudonym RX was garnering because she was only focused on her glamorous event plans and immediate profit margins. She still believed that I was just a failed sister who scribbled on pieces of scrap wood to kill time, and her arrogance made her blind to the truth that she was guarding a world-class talent right beneath her feet. 1 year passed as Miranda remained consumed by the shallow vanity of her event planning empire, while my own hidden world began to transform in ways she could never imagine. I had reached out to my friend Deanna, who worked at a small but respected gallery on the edge of town, to quietly arrange for the sale of my new paintings under a strict anonymous consignment agreement. Deanna was the only person who knew the truth behind the pseudonym, and she handled every transaction with a level of professional discretion that protected my identity from my sister's prying eyes. The money from these secret sales started flowing into a private bank account I had opened in the city, providing me with a flickering flame of hope that I might one day be able to escape the suffocating prison of that basement. Every digit added to my balance felt like a brick in the wall of my future freedom, even as I continued to scrub Miranda's floors and endure the constant verbal abuse from her and Preston. While I lived as a ghost in the shadows of the limestone villa, the local art community in Omaha began to buzz with rumors about a mysterious artist known only as RX, whose haunting landscapes possessed an undeniable inner strength. Critics described the work as a raw manifestation of human suffering and resilience, which made the demand for my paintings skyrocket among the wealthy elite who frequented the high-end galleries. It was a bizarre and surreal experience to hear Miranda mention the name RX during her phone calls with clients while I was standing right behind her polishing the silverware or vacuuming the heavy carpets. She would speak of the artist with a forced air of sophistication, as if she were an expert on the subject, never realizing for a single second that the genius she praised was the same woman she treated like an unpaid servant. The tension in the house reached a new level when Miranda secured a massive contract to organize the largest winter charity gala of the year for the city's most prominent families. Instead of hiring a professional printing service for the invitations, she decided to exploit my skills once again by forcing me to hand-paint 100 elaborate cards to save on production costs. Miranda handed me a stack of premium cardstock and a list of demands for intricate floral borders that required hours of meticulous labor for each individual piece. I was expected to complete this monumental task in addition to my regular household chores, which meant I was frequently forced to stay awake until the early hours of the morning under the dim light of my basement bulb. My eyes burned from the strain, and my fingers grew stiff from clutching the fine brushes, but Miranda showed no mercy as she constantly checked my progress with a judgmental scowl. Preston took every opportunity to boast to his friends during their frequent dinner parties about how talented and resourceful his wife was for managing such a complex event with such personal touches. He would lean back in his leather chair with a glass of bourbon and brag about Miranda's supposed artistic vision while I was in the kitchen washing the very dishes they had just used. Miranda has such an eye for detail that she even oversees the creation of the invitations herself to ensure everything is perfect for our guests, Preston would say with a smug grin that made my blood boil with a silent and helpless rage. Neither of them ever acknowledged that I was the one doing the actual work while they collected the praise and built their reputations on the back of my exhausted labor. One evening, after I had spent nearly 20 hours straight working on the cards and cleaning the house, I finally gathered the courage to mention my desire to move out and live independently. I stood in the doorway of the living room with my hands trembling as I told Miranda that I had saved a little bit of money and wanted to find a small apartment of my own. Miranda didn't even look up from her laptop as she let out a cold and mocking laugh that felt like a physical blow to my chest. Do you honestly think anyone in this city would hire a pathetic failure like you after your disastrous divorce and your long gap in employment? She asked before looking me dead in the eye with a terrifying intensity. She threatened that if I ever tried to leave, she would use her influence to spread rumors that I was mentally unstable and a thief to ensure I would starve on the streets of Omaha. The cruelty of her words was a stark reminder of the power she held over my life at that moment, even as my secret identity as RX continued to gain momentum in the outside world. I retreated to my freezing basement room and realized that the fame of my alter ego was rising in direct proportion to the level of ruthless exploitation I was suffering under Miranda's roof. I looked at the unfinished invitation spread across my makeshift desk and felt a strange sense of irony knowing that these people would soon be paying thousands of dollars for my work, while I was being threatened with homelessness by my own sister. I picked up my brush and continued to work in the silence of the night, because I knew that every stroke brought me closer to the day when the shadows would finally be lifted. 3 days before the fateful gala, the pressure within the house had reached its peak like a ticking time bomb, waiting for the slightest spark to ignite. The local news was saturated with reports about the arrival of a world-renowned art collector and critic, Mr. Sterling, who was traveling to Omaha specifically to attend the event, in hopes of discovering fresh artistic talent. Miranda was obsessed with the idea of impressing him to elevate her firm's prestige, but she viewed my existence as a shameful secret that needed to be hidden even further in the shadows during his visit. She cornered me in the kitchen and handed me a heavy crate of tarnished silver platters and heirloom cutlery, demanding that every single piece be polished to a mirror shine before the guest list was finalized. The sheer volume of the task was overwhelming, yet I saw a narrow window of opportunity when Miranda announced she would be out all afternoon for final venue walkthroughs and floral consultations. I retreated to my basement sanctuary with the silver, but my heart was focused on a large canvas that had been calling to me for weeks in the flickering dimness of my room. I had been pouring every ounce of my remaining strength into a masterpiece I titled The Silence, a dark and evocative oil painting that captured the suffocating beauty of a soul trapped beneath a frozen lake. This was the piece I intended to have my friend deliver to the gallery, so that Mr. Sterling might see it during his private viewing sessions before the main event. My hands moved with a desperate precision as I applied the final layers of deep cerulean and charcoal, losing myself in the rhythm of the brush and forgetting the world of servitude that existed just above my head. The smell of linseed oil and turpentine filled the stagnant air, providing a scent of freedom that was far more intoxicating than any perfume Miranda owned. The basement door suddenly creaked open and slammed against the stone wall with a violence that shattered my concentration and sent my heart into a frantic rhythm. Miranda had returned home hours earlier than expected, her face flushed with a mixture of professional stress and a brewing storm of irrational anger that always seemed to find me as its target. She stood at the bottom of the wooden stairs, her eyes widening in disbelief as she saw me standing at my makeshift easel with a palette in hand instead of the polishing cloth she had assigned me. The silver platters sat neglected on the cold concrete floor, their tarnished surfaces mocking her sense of control and authority over my every waking second. A terrifying explosion of rage erupted from her as she lunged across the small space, her voice rising to a shrill scream that echoed off the damp cinder-block walls. I have been working myself to the bone to build a reputation while I feed and clothe you for free, and this is how you repay my charity by painting this useless garbage. Miranda shrieked, while she snatched a sharp letter opener from a nearby packing crate. She grabbed the edge of my canvas with a strength born of pure malice and began to slash at the wet oil paint with the jagged metal blade in a frantic and rhythmic motion. You think you are an artist, Roxanne, but you are nothing more than a delusional failure who is going to ruin the most important night of my entire career with your pathetic hobbies. I stood frozen in place as I watched months of my emotional labor being shredded into ribbons of stained fabric right before my eyes. The sound of the canvas tearing was like a physical blow to my chest, yet I found that I couldn't even summon a single tear to mourn the destruction of my greatest work. Miranda threw the ruined remains onto the floor and stepped on the wooden frame, her expensive heels snapping the pine supports with a sickening crack that signaled the end of our unspoken truce. She ordered me to clean up the mess and finish the silver before she returned for dinner, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence of the underground shadows. I knelt down on the cold floor and began to pick up the jagged pieces of the frame and the strips of ruined canvas, feeling a strange and hollow calm settle over my spirit. I realized in that moment that the woman who had just left the room was no longer my sister, but merely a stranger who happened to share my blood and a history of shared trauma. I gently lifted the largest remaining piece of the painting that still preserved the image of the frozen lake, then slipped the torn fragments into my jacket as though I were salvaging the last pieces of our shattered relationship. I didn't feel defeated because the act of destruction had finally clarified the boundaries of my reality and solidified my resolve to never let her touch my soul again. I went back to the silver platters and began to polish them with a mechanical efficiency, knowing that the masterpiece she thought she had destroyed was now etched permanently into my mind. On Saturday night, the grand ballroom of the Magnolia Hotel in Omaha was awash in golden light, serving as the prestigious stage where the entire elite of the city had gathered for the winter event of the year. Miranda had forced me to accompany her not as a guest or even a family member, but as a glorified personal assistant tasked with carrying her heavy designer clutch and holding her water whenever she needed to adjust her expensive silk gown. She had insisted that I wear an old, oversized black dress that hung limply on my frame, claiming it was necessary so that I would remain invisible in the background while she played the part of the successful socialite. I felt the weight of the humiliation as I followed several paces behind her through the crowd of polished professionals, yet I remained stubbornly defiant in my own quiet way. Tucked tightly inside my coat was the central fragment of the slashed canvas that Miranda had tried to destroy only days ago, and I held onto that jagged piece of ruined art as if it were a physical manifestation of my enduring spirit. The atmosphere in the room was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the hum of superficial conversation as the guests awaited the arrival of the legendary Mr. Sterling. When he finally entered the ballroom, a respectful silence fell over the crowd, and I watched from the shadows as he began to pace slowly through the gallery area Miranda had meticulously curated. Mr. Sterling wore a look of profound disappointment on his face, while his sharp eyes glanced toward the colorful but shallow decorative paintings that lined the walls without lingering on a single one of them. Miranda approached him with her most practiced smile and began to chirp about the artistic vision behind the evening, but the collector merely offered a polite nod before turning his gaze toward the exit. It was clear to everyone in the room that he had found nothing of value in the local offerings, and I could see the panic beginning to flicker in the corners of my sister's eyes as she realized her bid for his approval was failing spectacularly. In a desperate attempt to salvage the fading energy of the room and create a moment of light-hearted entertainment, Miranda suddenly turned toward the dark corner where I was standing and gestured for me to join her on the elevated stage. She had a manic glint in her eyes as she decided that humiliating me in front of the city's most powerful people would be the perfect way to display her own superiority and charm. As I walked toward the podium with my head bowed, Miranda noticed that I was clutching the bundle under my coat, and she reached out to snatch the microphone with a triumphant smirk on her face. Ladies and gentlemen, before we conclude the evening, I want to show you exactly how much effort I put into my charity work, even when it comes to the most hopeless cases in my own family, Miranda announced, as her voice filled the speakers and echoed off the high ceilings. She pointed a finger at me and laughed before continuing her cruel performance for the benefit of the amused onlookers who were already beginning to titter at my expense. My little sister Roxanne insists on carrying around this pile of trash as if it were a masterpiece, so I thought we would let you all see how truly pathetic she has become before I officially auction her off to the highest bidder. Miranda reached over and grabbed the edge of the slashed canvas, pulling it into the light for everyone to see the jagged cuts and the raw, bleeding colors of the frozen lake I had painted. A collective gasp of mocking laughter rippled through the front rows, and I stood there in my tattered dress, while the elite of Omaha stared at my most private pain as if it were a circus act. The mock auction began with Miranda declaring that the starting bid for my services as a snow shoveler was just $1 because she claimed that was the only value I had left to offer society. Preston stood near the front of the stage and began to hoot with delight, waving his champagne glass in the air while he looked at me with a gaze full of pure, unadulterated contempt. I will bid $2 for her if she actually knows how to wash a car without leaving streaks on the windows, Preston shouted over the noise, sparking another wave of cruel jests from the men sitting around him. I stood perfectly still on that stage while the laughter grew louder, feeling the cold weight of the ruined painting in my hands and the burning gaze of Mr. Sterling from the back of the room. The atmosphere in the massive ballroom seemed to freeze completely following the powerful $1 million offer from the mysterious man standing at the back of the room. Mr. Sterling began to walk slowly toward the stage with a steady and unwavering gaze that caused the smug smile on Miranda's lips to falter and turn into a mask of awkward confusion. She clearly believed that the wealthy collector was simply playing along with her cruel game and intended to pay a fortune just to humiliate me further by hiring me as an elite servant for his estate. Miranda straightened her posture and reached out to greet him with a practiced hand as he approached the stairs, but the legendary critic ignored her entirely and brushed past her as if she were nothing more than an invisible obstacle in his path. I stood there trembling under the intense spotlight while clutching the slashed remnants of my painting against my chest, feeling my breath hitch as the most powerful man in the art world stopped only inches away from me. Mr. Sterling did not look at my face or acknowledge the tattered black dress that Miranda had forced me to wear, but instead, he kept his eyes fixed solely on the ruined fragment of the canvas I was holding. The silence in the Magnolia Hotel was so absolute that I could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system, while 200 of Omaha's most prominent citizens leaned forward in their seats to witness what was happening. He reached out a gloved hand and gently tilted the edge of the wood so that the overhead lights hit the bottom corner, where a jagged tear had nearly severed my final stroke. With a voice that carried to every corner of the ballroom without the need for a microphone, he pointed to the small and blood-red letters intertwined with the deep cerulean oil paint. I am paying $1 million this evening, but make no mistake that I am not bidding for the labor of this woman as a servant," Mr. Sterling declared while his eyes burned with a mixture of reverence and professional triumph. He turned slightly toward the stunned audience and raised his voice so that his next words felt like a physical blow to everyone who had been laughing moments before. "I am paying $1 million for the legendary RX signature that sits right here on this tragic masterpiece, because I have spent the last 2 years searching for the genius capable of such raw and agonizing beauty." The revelation hit the room like a shockwave, and I could see Miranda's face drain of all color until she looked like a ghost standing under the golden chandeliers of her own event. Mr. Sterling proceeded to confirm to the entire crowd that the brushwork on my slashed canvas was identical to the paintings that had been fetching record prices in private galleries across the country. He spoke openly about the immense market value of the work Miranda had dismissed as trash, and he didn't hesitate to mention that the artist known as RX was currently the most sought-after talent in the modern landscape movement. Miranda looked as if she were about to collapse, because she suddenly realized that she had been throwing away hundreds of thousands of dollars while treating a global artistic phenomenon like an unpaid maid. The sheer weight of her own ignorance and greed seemed to crush her spirit in real time as she stared at the rubbish she had personally rock-knot with a letter opener only days ago. A massive roar of astonishment erupted from the crowd below, as the people who had been mocking me just minutes earlier now surged toward the stage with expressions of profound awe and sudden respect. The same guests who had laughed at Preston's cruel jokes about car washing were now pulling out their phones to take photos of the woman they had previously considered invisible. I could see the shift in their eyes as they looked at me with genuine admiration, while their previous warmth toward Miranda had vanished and was replaced by looks of cold disgust and sharp whispers about her character. They began to realize the true nature of the charity Miranda had bragged about, seeing clearly that she had been suppressing a world-class talent right under her own roof, out of pure jealousy and spite. Preston sat frozen in his chair with his mouth hanging open as he watched his social standing dissolve in the heat of Mr. Sterling's endorsement, while Miranda stood paralyzed in the center of the stage. She tried to stammer out a defense or a claim that she had nurtured my talent from the beginning, but the crowd simply turned their backs on her to focus on the artist she had tried to auction off for a single dollar. For the first time in 2 years, I didn't feel like the failed sister or the divorced burden that they had tried to convince me I was, but rather, I felt like the creator I had always been. I gazed at the torn remains of the silence and understood that its destruction had become the ultimate confirmation of who I truly was. And as I stepped down from that stage beside Mr. Sterling, I knew the version of myself that had once belonged to Miranda had disappeared forever. 1 month after that fateful night, another blizzard covered Omaha in a thick blanket of white. But my heart finally felt the warmth of an internal spring that no winter could ever touch again. The fallout from the gala was swift and devastating for those who had spent years building their lives on the hollow foundations of vanity and cruelty. Miranda's event planning company Prestige Planning declared bankruptcy after every major donor and corporate sponsor pulled their funding in a massive wave of public backlash. The elite of Nebraska were not just offended by her behavior, but they were terrified of being associated with a woman whose character had been so thoroughly exposed as toxic and manipulative. Preston fared no better as his real estate firm terminated his contract immediately following the scandal to protect their own reputation from the stain of his documented arrogance. While they were scrambling to save their sinking ship, my friend Deanna acted on my behalf to file a formal lawsuit against Miranda for the theft and unauthorized sale of my very first painting. We had secured every piece of evidence from the original gallery transaction records to the testimony of the interior designer, ensuring that Miranda would finally be held legally accountable for her greed. I didn't need the money anymore, but I needed the world to know that my art had never been hers to sell or dismiss as garbage. I used a small portion of my newfound wealth to move into a massive sun-drenched studio in a vibrant part of the city, where the high ceilings and white walls were no longer a prison, but a vast canvas for my future. I spent my days in a blur of productive energy preparing for my first international exhibition, while surrounded by people who respected my vision and valued my voice. The silence of my new life was interrupted only once when my phone rang with an unrecognized number that turned out to be Miranda calling from a public payphone near the bus station. Her voice was a ragged mess of desperate sobs and frantic apologies as she begged me for financial help, reciting empty promises about the sanctity of our blood relation. She tried to convince me that her cruelty had been a misguided attempt to push me toward success, but I had finally grown deaf to her manipulation and gaslighting. I answered her with a voice that was cold, steady, and entirely devoid of the fear she had spent 2 years instilling in me. You tore our sisterhood apart the same way you ripped that painting to pieces in the basement. Miranda, and no apology can mend a soul once it has already been destroyed, I said firmly before she could interrupt with yet another excuse. I told her to never contact me again, and to accept the reality that she was now a stranger to me, a ghost from a past that I had officially outgrown. I hung up the phone and blocked the number, permanently stepping out onto my balcony to breathe in the crisp, cold air of absolute and total freedom. I stood before a fresh, massive easel in the center of my studio and picked up a brush to begin a new piece filled with vibrant, defiant colors, leaving the darkness of that Omaha basement behind me forever. Before we conclude today's story, let's take a moment to look deeper into the journey Roxanne just traveled, because her victory is about much more than just a $1 million check. It is easy to look at Miranda and Preston as the villains, but the real tragedy was the psychological prison Roxanne was forced to inhabit while her own sister tried to extinguish her light. Don't go just yet, because there is a powerful lesson here that we all need to remember when life feels like a cold basement. First and foremost, never allow the narrow-minded and shallow opinions of others to define your worth, as people like Miranda will always try to make you feel small, just so they can feel significant. Roxanne's talent didn't change the night Mr. Sterling appeared. She was a genius the entire time she was scrubbing floors, but the world only saw it when she stopped believing her sister's lies. Secondly, we often hear that family is everything, but we must be brave enough to admit that family can sometimes become a toxic chain that prevents us from breathing. Choosing yourself and walking away from a blood relation who thrives on your suffering is not an act of betrayal, but the ultimate act of self-preservation and courage. Now I want to hear from you in the community. If you were in Roxanne's position, would you have been able to walk away so decisively, or would you have given Miranda one last chance to make things right? Do you think her refusal to reconcile was too harsh, or was it the only way to truly be free? Please share your thoughts and personal perspectives in the comments below, as your insights often help others find their own strength. Thank you so much for staying with Roxanne until the very end, and we truly appreciate